All right, folks, here we are. It's 1 o'clock. I'm going to get started. Thank you for being here. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here for this webinar, and I appreciate it. Today, what I want to talk to you about is really this concept right here, which is what is the meeting for? The promise of this webinar was to change your meetings forever with one strategy, and I don't think that's hyperbole. I've worked with people from all over the world on how to improve their meetings, and this one distinction, this one framework gets incredible results when people understand it and when they embrace it, because it allows them to answer this question. So rather than pontificating about it, what I want to do is I want to take you through in 12 minutes, which is a very short amount of time, take you through the concept so you can understand it. You may not get all the tactics, but hopefully you will get the strategy. So let's get started here. One of the reasons why, like I just alluded to, meetings are so bad is because we don't know why we're in the room. I mean, when a decision comes up in an organization, and we're talking about decisions today, we call a meeting without thinking through why are we calling the meeting? What is the role of the meeting in this process? We kind of just show up in a room and together we say, well, what are we going to do? We're not going to do that today. We're going to think much more thoughtfully about what the meeting is for. And the thesis here today is what I call triple D, the triple D framework, which means we should be treating different decisions differently. I'm going to say that again because that's the entire point of this webinar. We should be treating different decisions differently. The modern meeting is different depending, its function is different depending on what kind of issue we're dealing with, what kind of decision we're making. So here's the start, okay? You need to ask yourself the fundamental question whenever a decision pops up. Whenever a decision crosses your desk, you don't call a meeting first. You ask this question: how consequential is this decision? How consequential is this decision? I'm going to argue there's three answers to that. There is, it can be a high consequence decision, it can be a low consequence decision, or it can be a no consequence decision. So let's deal with the no consequence decision first. This means when a decision is largely inconsequential, meaning, you know what, this decision, it doesn't really matter, it just needs to be made. It's amazing how many times where we have to make inconsequential decisions in organizations. What is the meeting for? The meeting is for nothing. We do not hold meetings for inconsequential decisions, okay? This idea of holding a meeting, these are just not applicable, for an inconsequential decision is a waste of our time. One of the reasons why people complain so much about meetings and the way we lead them is because we hold them for the wrong reason to begin with. If a decision really doesn't matter that much, right? Don't waste our time with a meeting. Make the decision yourself as quickly as possible. You have our permission to do so, okay? Maybe you want to consult somebody individually, fine, but your job is to make that decision as quickly as possible because by definition, this decision has very little consequence, right? There's no decision that actually has no consequence, but we're deeming this an inconsequential decision so we can make it and move on. Okay, so that's the easy part. We've dealt with no consequence decisions. So what about decisions that are consequential, right? They are important. Well, I argue that there's two buckets here. There's high consequence decisions and low consequence decisions. For simplicity's sake, instead of saying that every single time, I'm just going to refer them to small decisions and big decisions, okay? Let's say, what is the difference? Well, the reason why we're making this distinction is because the priorities are very different depending on when we're dealing with something that's big and something that's small. When we're dealing with a small decision, the priority is speed, okay? When we're dealing with a decision of high consequence, the priority is accuracy, okay? When you have a decision, you can't have both, right? I mean, it's very hard to achieve speed and accuracy at the same time. When you have a decision that's kind of important, but it's not super important, and you know, there's not a lot of risk involved. we want to just make the decision as quickly as possible so that we can implement the action. The important thing is we move forward as quickly as possible. But when a decision is hugely consequential, when it is very big, when it means that it will sink us if we get it wrong, and if it means humongous rewards if we get it right, it's useful to spend some time thinking about the decision, to slow down and realize that we want to have a meeting to help us figure out whether this is the best decision. Two very, very different priorities, and therefore warrant two very different kinds of meetings. So let's tackle these one at a time, okay? If we're talking about a small decision, we know that we want to get the decision done as quickly as possible, and we want, most importantly, the resulting action to happen as quickly as possible. Well, the function of the meeting, I'm going to argue, is coordination. We want to get everybody on the same page together, because if we were to make the decision ourselves, you know, like an autocrat, and just send everyone the memo like we often do with inconsequential decisions, people wouldn't really know what to do next, right? This decision might require that there's a coordination of activities in order to put that decision into the world. So it helps to get everybody in a room together in order to finalize the decision and to bring it into the world. So the goal here, though, is buy-in, right? When we make a decision, when we're talking about a small decision, what we want to do is we want to, it's too small, it's too low of a consequence in order to involve the group too early, right? If we try to have the group make the decision, it's just going to take too long. So what we want to do is we want to have our initial plan. We want to make the decision ourselves as the leader, okay? That doesn't mean we can't consult people individually, get data, intelligence. Those things are all important. But we fundamentally should be thinking about, okay, this is a low consequence decision. I don't have time to outsource this to the group. What is the path? What is the path that I think we should be on? Well, now what you need to do is you need to get people's buy-in, because if people aren't committed to the decision, then it's very likely they're not going to move as fast as you want them to. You need to get people on the same page. And so that's why what you want to do for this kind of meeting is you want to sell the decision. You want to explain to people, here's why I made the decision, you know, talk about their concerns, figure out if there's some modifications you need to make for the decision, but ultimately the bias is towards action here, right? So that doesn't mean that you're not amenable to feedback, right? If somebody raises a good concern or good reasons as to why this is the wrong decision, you should hear them out. But the difference here is the posture is the burden of proof is on them, right? Basically, the posture is it's like the train is leaving the station, and it's up to you guys to convince me why it shouldn't, because this is a low consequence decision, right? And as a leader, I need to move things forward. So give me your concerns, give me your feedback, give me what you think we should modify this to, but remember, this is low consequence, and we're going to try to resolve this as quickly as possible. So the final deliverable from the meeting, what is the outcome, what is the tangible outcome, is you want an action plan. You want a sense of, you want a finalized decision that everybody's on board with, they have buy-in, and you want people's commitment on what are the next steps. How are we going to coordinate? What are the specific commitments people are going to make to coordinate the action so we bring this decision into the world as quickly as possible? So that's what we do when we talk about small decisions, okay? When we talk about big decisions, hugely consequential decisions, we need a different playbook, right? Because we don't want speed as much as we want accuracy. In fact, too much speed will ensure that maybe we have a terrible decision, and that's going to be hugely problematic. So the function for the modern meeting when it comes to big decisions is conflict. What we know from decision-making theory is that when you get a group to debate, honest debate, when you get a group to disagree with each other, that debate actually leads to better decisions. So the goal of this meeting isn't to have people come together, at least not at first. The goal is to have people disagree, right? And this is why we have debates, is to make sure we have good decisions. Now, debates are costly, they're expensive, and they take time, but if it's a high consequence decision, it's worth it. So what is the goal? The goal, instead of buy-in, is consensus. So buy-in means, hey, I know what the path is. I generally know what the path is. I want your guys' support for this. Consensus means, hey, listen, I'm not, confident enough to tell you that I know exactly what the path is. This is a big decision, so I want us to try to make this decision together. Consensus is very different than buy-in. It's more of a group activity. It's not you selling. It's you having an open mind and trying to figure out what is the best idea, even if it's not your idea. Remember, you might come in with an initial plan or proposal or an idea for what the decision is, but you need to throw it to the group and try to get consensus, general agreement around what is the best idea. And the deliverable here is the final decision. The final decision is so important that we don't want to worry about coordinating action yet. We just need to come out with a final decision. If we come out with a final decision that we have consensus on, that is a worthwhile time for the debate. Now, realize that often you won't get consensus, right? Consensus is often elusive. And so you as the decision maker need to make the decision. You need to be the tiebreaker. And that is the goal of the modern meeting. So in short, because we're running out of time here, and I'm going to take questions in a second in the optional Q&A, but we need to treat different decisions differently. We need to understand whether this decision is a no consequence decision, in which case it's trivial, make it, don't even hold the meeting. We need to understand if it's a low consequence decision, in which case the goal is speed. We want to make sure that this decision is made as quickly as possible and the resulting action is coordinated. And so that's why we hold a coordination type of meeting. And finally, if the meeting is big, if it's high consequence, high risk, we need to make sure we get it right. So it's worth stopping, slowing down, and holding a really kind of thoughtful debate that basically has people disagree, but ultimately converges on consensus. So I know this is a lot to deal with, and this is just the beginning of this framework. I hope to talk about this more in future webinars. But right now, I'm going to take some questions. If you have time, feel free to stay on, and we can answer some questions and get a little bit tactical. But if you have to go, I understand. I'm going to be recording this session, hopefully, and sending it out to you so you can watch it again and share it with your friends. So for those of you who need to drop off now, thank you very much for your time. For those of you who have questions, let's have them and let's talk about it. Okay, so if you have questions right now, submit them in the little chat box and we can discuss. Okay, so one of the questions that I see here is that how do you know if something is high or low consequence decisions? How do we know how consequential a decision is? This is kind of the million-dollar question, right? Because this framework is straightforward once you can classify where the decision fits inside this matrix, right? Like how important is the decision? The problem is that there's no formula that can tell you this, right? So, for example, let's say it was, and it's also very subjective, right? Let's say you are hiring a vendor, and that's the decision. For some, when it comes to some vendors, that's a hugely consequential decision, right? If it's a vendor that deals with mission critical issues, that's a very, very important decision, and you need to slow down and focus on accuracy. If it's a vendor that you've been working with forever and you just need to renew it, or it's not somebody that, it's somebody who delivers paper to the organization, office supplies, maybe that's not as critical. I don't mean to offend any office supply companies out there. But the point is, it's going to depend on the circumstances and your own judgment. I mean, for some companies, one decision could be very low consequence, could be a small decision, but for another team or another company, that very same decision could be hugely consequential. So what you have to do is what I argue is, what you should do is you should sit down with a pen and a paper and your team ideally, and think about some of the major decisions that come up, or some of the regular decisions that come up all the time. And you as a team discuss, well, what exactly is this decision? How important is this decision versus this one, right? And what you find is, as you try to classify these decisions as a group, what you'll find is that if everything is a high consequence decision, then nothing is a high consequence decision, right? If everything is really important, then nothing is really important. So what you need to do is you need to get good at figuring out, okay, which ones are less important than others? Everything seems important in the moment, but if you can really come down and classify decisions in terms of the level of importance, that's when you're going to be able to treat different decisions differently, which, remember, is the goal of this entire webinar. Okay, let's see if there are any other questions here. John Windsor asks, what does DDD stand for? It stands for different decisions differently. The modern meeting should treat different decisions differently. If a decision is very important, you need a meeting that slows down and focuses on accuracy. If the meeting, or if the decision is not as important, you want speed. The goal is to get this decision passed as quickly as possible, resolve it, so we can focus on the action. Another question we have here is on, what is your opinion on regularly recurring status meetings? Sometimes good discussion comes from this, but frequently regarded as a waste. How can this be improved? This is a fantastic question, because this is exactly what I'm talking about. Status, by definition, status meetings don't treat different decisions differently. Because when you have this regular standing meeting every week, it basically, the thought is, okay, this is a regular status meeting. The purpose of these meetings are all the same and they repeat. But that is not the case. Maybe one week there is a very consequential issue that arises, right? Well, then we need to slow down and focus on accuracy. Well, another week maybe there's nothing that happens, and the issues that we're talking about are hugely inconsequential. Well, then that's a low status. That's a low consequence decision, and we need to focus on speed. And maybe we don't even need the meeting because it's just inconsequential. I mean, there are so many times where people have these regular, either daily or weekly status meetings, that week there's just nothing is consequential, and yet you feel, because of the inertia, you feel like you need to keep the meeting going, and so this is what frustrates people. This is why you have meetings that end up talking about nothing, where people walk out saying, wow, that felt like an entire waste of my time. It's precisely because you didn't go through this process of classifying what is the nature of the issue that we're discussing in these status meetings. Let's take another question. Could you also use a similar method to decide who needs to be at the meeting? Substitute critically for consequence. That's a great insight, Troy. You get extra points for that. Everything is going to be informed by these decisions, right? We didn't go through the tactics, but every decision from, every consideration from who's going to be at the meeting to how many people to how long is the meeting, these are all going to be informed by this classification up here, specifically who's going to be at the meeting, right? Because what we know is that if you're going to have a debate, that's a very different people might need to be there versus if you're focusing on coordination, right? Because if the decision is already made, I mean, largely speaking, because you've already decided in advance and the goal is just to finalize the decision, you might not need some people in the room. For example, somebody who you've already consulted with, who's already said their piece, you might not need them in the room. If it's a debate, you absolutely want that person in the room because you want that person's voice to be heard. And so these decisions are so important, and they're informed by the very thesis, which is we need to treat different decisions differently. So that's a great insight, Troy. Do you have a time frame for the low-level meetings? No, because there's no rule of thumb here. The general rule of thumb, or at least the general way to think about all meetings, is they should be shorter than you think. So there's this thing called Parkinson's Law, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, which says that an activity or task expands to fit the container allotted for it. So the easy way to think about this is, if you have a test, if you're in college and you have a test and you have 3 weeks, it's going to take you 3 weeks to study. If you have a test that's tomorrow, it's going to take you, it's going to take you 1 day to study. Same thing with meetings, right? Like if you schedule 2 hours in order to make a decision, it's going to take you 2 hours to make a decision. If you scheduled it for 30 minutes, you probably would have done the same thing, but it would have only taken you 30 minutes. And so at some point, obviously, though, it's too short and you're not able to have sufficient time to do the activity. But the question you need to ask is not how long should the meeting be, but how short can the meeting be that I can get away with it, right? How short is it possible that I can make this meeting that we can achieve the task? Because even high consequence decisions, the temptation is to well, this is a really important decision, this is mission critical, we should spend 3 hours debating it. But what happens is debates turn circular, people start making the same points over and over again, and even the surest decision, even the one where you have so much certainty, over that much time debating and analyzing, at some point, by the end, everybody's going to be like, I have no idea what we need to do, right? Because the anxiety creeps up and fear comes to the table. So I can't tell you exactly how long the meeting should be, but definitely shorter than you think. I'm going to take a couple more questions. This is a really good question. Daba, I apologize if I pronounce your name correctly. Why can't we combine speed and accuracy? Speed and accuracy are usually run inversely proportional to each other, right? So there's a trade-off here. Like, let's say, for example, you're writing an article, you're writing an email, right? If you want to get this email out as quickly as possible, you better be comfortable with some typos, because when you're writing this email out and if your goal is speed, you're going to sacrifice accuracy. You're just not going to be able to spend as much time and attention focusing on the details, focusing on the quality, right? But if you're sending this email to the CEO of your company and you want it to be right, then you better realize you're sacrificing speed. If you try to spend as much time as you were in that quick email, it's going to end up being of low quality, and there's going to be typos. So you need to spend more time. So this is just kind of a law that sometimes you can combine speed and accuracy, but they usually live and exist within a trade-off matrix. Okay, one more question here. We have another question regarding how to classify high or low, no consequence decisions. I know we just talked about this, but I want to reiterate it because it's a good point, which is that this is a judgment. This is one of the most important judgment leaders make, and it's entirely uncertain. And I know this is what's going to scare people, is they're going to not know, well, how do I know when something is low or when something is high, when something is a big decision, when something is a small decision. This is something that is going to, one, take time to build an intuition for, because if you haven't practiced this, it's going to be very formidable in the beginning. But two, it's going to take usually a conversation with your team. One of the reasons why this is so problematic and why this doesn't happen is because teams have no sense over what is consequential and what is not consequential, right? So when it comes to inconsequential decisions, I may think something is inconsequential, and I may just make the decision and then send out a memo, but the problem is everyone else doesn't think it's inconsequential, and they yell at me. They say, well, why didn't you consult me about this? And so that's hugely problematic. That's one of the reasons why we don't make enough decisions quickly enough, is because we want to make sure we're not offending people. That is cancer to an organization. That is the recipe for delay and procrastination and just a lack of urgency. So what you need to do is you need to start a dialogue with your team, with the people around you, and at least begin by agreeing, let's talk about what are the decisions that are so inconsequential that we shouldn't waste our time consulting each other. If you can just agree, and you won't agree specifically on everything, but if you can have a good sense of what some of those decisions are, the amount of speed that you will acquire as a team is extraordinary. There's a great book, at least it's a great title, by one of the Coveys, I think it was, called The Speed of Trust. Trust actually has a speed to it, as a speed associated with it. If you trust people to make the right decisions and you don't have to consult them, the velocity that people can use in order to make decisions and get stuff done is extraordinary. So, you want to discuss with your team the consequentiality of all decisions, but start by at least trying to figure out what are the decisions that are just totally trivial, inconsequential, and just not worth our time. Listen, I want to thank everyone for staying here. I know this is a tough topic, and we're going to talk about this more in the future. I'm also going to videotape this. This is a very important topic, so I hope you'll share this with your colleagues, because this stuff works better when your team knows it as well. For right now, thank you, and I'll see you next week.